There is no credible record of Angus Maddison, the prominent economic historian, explicitly stating that India was the richest country in the world in any of his works. Maddison's research focused on historical economic data, particularly regarding GDP and income levels of various countries throughout history. While he did provide data that showed India's historical economic significance, he did not make such a blanket statement about it being the richest country without context. It's important to rely on accurate citations and context when attributing statements to historical figures. Angus Maddison's historical economic data does indeed show significant changes in India's economic performance during the colonial period. According to his research, India's per capita GDP grew at a slower rate under the rule of the British East India Company, approximately 70% increase compared to the subsequent period of British Crown rule, which saw more substantial economic growth, around a fourfold increase of 400%. Angus Maddison did not say that India was the richest country in the world. Angus Maddison said that India was one of the largest economies for most of the period between the 1st and 18th centuries due to its population but not due to its industrialization. In his book, The World Economy, A Millennial Perspective, he estimated that India accounted for roughly 30% of the world's GDP in the year 1000 but 24% of the world's GDP by 1700 and fell to 18% of the world GDP by 1757 before the British and fell to 12% by 1820. Claims that the British reduced India GDP are erroneous, fake news. Although India GDP was 4% of world GDP by 1947, India GDP grew exponentially under the British, but the rest of the world GDP grew even faster and higher. That's the fault of Indians, not the fault of the British. However, it is important to note that Maddison's estimates are based on a number of assumptions and approximations, and there is some debate among historians about their accuracy. Additionally, it is important to keep in mind that GDP is not a perfect measure of economic well-being, and it is possible for a country to have a high GDP but still have a large population living in poverty. That said, Maddison's work provides a valuable perspective on the long-term economic history of India and the world. It shows that India was once a major economic power, and that its decline in relative terms is a relatively recent phenomenon. Here is a quote from Maddison's book. India was the world's largest, not the richest, economy from 1 AD to about 1700 AD, accounting for about 25 to 30% of world GDP. This was due to a number of factors, including India's large population, its fertile land, and its strategic location on the Silk Road. It is also important to note that Maddison's estimates are not universally accepted. Some historians argue that his estimates of India's GDP in the early centuries are too high. However, even if his estimates are off by a few percentage points, it is clear that India was a major economic power for a long period of time. Here are some Indian historians and economists who dispute Angus Maddison's high claims of India's share of world GDP. Tirthankar Roy. Roy is an economic historian at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He has argued that Maddison's estimates of India's GDP in the early centuries are too high. Roy estimates that India's share of world GDP in the year 1000 was around 15%, not 30%. Irfan Habib. Habib is a historian at Aligarh Muslim University. He has also argued that Maddison's estimates of India's GDP are too high. Habib estimates that India's share of world GDP in the year 1000 was around 20%. Bipin Chandra. Chandra is a historian at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has criticized Maddison's work for being based on flawed assumptions and for ignoring the negative impact of British colonial rule on the Indian economy. It is important to note that there is no consensus among historians and economists about the accuracy of Maddison's estimates. However, the work of Roy, Habib, and Chandra suggests that India's share of world GDP in the early centuries was lower than Maddison claims. Here are some of their estimates. Tirthankar Roy, 15%. Irfan Habib, 20%. Bipin Chandra does not provide a specific estimate, but argues that India's share of world GDP was lower than Maddison claims. It is also important to note that these estimates are also based on a number of assumptions and approximations. However, they provide a useful alternative to Maddison's estimates.